Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another edition of the Raw Prospect Podcast. My name is Michael Ween. Joining me tonight, as always, is my fantastic co-host, Mr. Amy Nixon. Thursday, August 15th, 7:15 p.m. local time in Houston, Texas, on what is a hot and humid day in the middle of August, as we expect here in the state of Texas. Emmy joining me from Austin. If you're watching us live for another edition of our 2024 NFL team previews and our power rankings countdown, where tonight we will be addressing teams 11, 10, and number 9 in our countdown. Make sure that if you're not already, you like the show. It helps the algorithm. And you subscribe if you really like what we do here. Tell your friends about it. We greatly appreciate all of that. So today we've got 3 teams. We've got a loaded show. We don't have a lot of time to waste, but joining me is the man himself, Mr. Emmy Nixon. What is up, Emmy?
I'm excited for this one, man. I've consumed an unholy amount of Cowboys content over the last few days leading up to this. Oh, I guess I just spoiled it, but yeah, the number 11 team is the Cowboys, my favorite team.
Can you
But regardless, I think the 3 teams we're going to cover tonight all have potential to end up higher than this ranking.
really quick anecdote before we get into the Dallas Cowboys, who start off tonight's show? Emmy's a diehard Cowboys fan, as everyone knows, mostly, unless you're new. The reason we haven't been, well, there are multiple reasons, but one of the reasons we haven't been live since our Sunday night Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports show is because I realized that my adapter that I've been using dating back to my freshman year of college was faulty, and it's bad. It happens. Adapters go bad once you've had them for 5-6 years, as I understand it. And so I had to order a new adapter on Tuesday. I got it in today, and it's working perfectly. So we shouldn't have any more problems on that end. And Emmy and I are having discussions about each upgrading our own podcast setups. But in order for me to record, I have to have the adapter. Otherwise, I have nowhere to plug in my mic because there's nowhere on my MacBook to plug it in. I can't use my monitor where I have all my stuff, all of my prep. I can't share my screen. It's just not a functional way to do a podcast when I don't have an adapter that works. I guess it just went out, but that's that. That's one of the reasons I wasn't able to do the recruiting show last night because of that. But we're all good now. The recruiting show should be sometime this weekend. If not, we'll just skip it for this week, and we'll go live this upcoming Wednesday when Michael Fasusi ultimately makes his decision. So,
right. And one more housekeeping thing actually is off camera. Me and Michael have talked about a consistent schedule for podcasting here. So, what we discussed is going to be some combination of Tuesdays, either Raw Prospect Podcast or Dit Hole. That's going to vary week to week. Same thing with Thursdays, either the main podcast or Dit Hole. And then, of course, Michael's recruiting show on Wednesdays, where I'm going to be joining in on certain weeks as well. And then the next day after that would be Sundays. So that will be our set schedule moving forward. That's going to be good for us for football season because we'll be able to react to college games on Sundays and react to NFL games on Tuesdays.
Exactly. And then I don't know how much previewing of games we're going to do. I know we'll do it on the college side of things. But on Thursdays, those will be shows that probably look ahead to the next week of football, react to Thursday night football, or they might be, once we get into basketball season, they might be basketball related shows. Who knows? It'll vary week to week, but as Emmy said, it's going to vary here until the NFL season starts, the first week of September. But once we get into the groove of the NFL season, it should be more of a set schedule where it'll be dit holes on Sunday nights, reacting to that week of college football, and then NFL episodes on Tuesday nights, reacting to the week of NFL football. So that's that. Anything else in me before we get into
Sorry about
tonight?
that.
Anything else before we get into the Cowboys? If not, just lead us off here. Are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Do you have anything else you need to say before we get into Dallas? Or otherwise, lead us off with the Cowboys. Are you there? Hello?
Crap. Okay. What is going on here? Okay,
Hello?
go ahead and talk.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay.
Let me just fix this.
What I was saying was, do you have anything else housekeeping-wise that you need to address? Otherwise, if you don't, lead us into our number 11 team, the Dallas Cowboys. Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
So strange. Okay. I think we're good. Here, I might just have to do this. I'm just gonna remove my phone's camera. I'll do this. There we go.
All right. Are you good?
Yep.
Okay. Lead us into Dallas then.
Okay, so my Cowboys 2023 season was a really good one, just up until the end, of course, which has been a theme year over year over year. But it doesn't discount the fact that this was one of the best teams in football, like over the course of the entire season. Dak was in the MVP conversation pretty late into the year, like all the way up until that Bills game, pretty much. And it was overwhelmingly positive from an offensive standpoint. And I got to give Mike McCarthy credit there because at this time last year, we were skeptical of what it would be with Mike McCarthy calling plays. And I thought he did a really good job. He was implementing motion. He was having a little bit of variety in terms of formations and trying not to be predictable. And I felt like as a play caller, he had a very successful season. But they ended up losing in the wild card round to the Green Bay Packers, the first team to lose to a 7th seed. And I think, going into this year, we'll talk about their offseason, but as of right now, Dak isn't paid yet. Mike Zimmer was brought in on a 1-year deal. CeeDee Lamb hasn't been paid. Micah Parsons hasn't been paid. So this is truly maybe a 1 year and tear it down type of season if things go poorly, which is crazy to think about.
I'll build off what you said as you're the resident Cowboys fan. Remember how magical everything looked the start of last year? Now, to a degree, the teams that they were facing were not great teams. But you can only play who's in front of you. And in those first 2 games where they played the 2 New York teams, I think both were primetime games.
Mm-hmm.
One may have been Monday night and one the other Sunday night, something along those lines. They beat the Giants in one of the more like impressive divisional beatdowns I've ever seen in prime time, 40-0 on Sunday night. And then they followed it up the next week, who, I mean, they were short Aaron Rodgers, but they beat the Jets 30-10. And in those two games, they were +7 in turnover margin. The Jets threw 5 interceptions, lost 2 fumbles, and fumbled 5 more times that they fortunately recovered, or else that could have been even uglier. The one thing, though, early on in the season that the Cowboys kind of struggled with, and it got better over the course of the season, and you have to credit Mike McCarthy for that to some extent, was the red zone offense. Through 5 weeks, even though they were winning a lot, they ranked 28th in red zone touchdown rate. And there were a variety of reasons for that. You look at the previous season in the red zone, they were number 2 in third down conversion rate. They were number 1 in bypassing third downs. They were number 1 in early down yards per play. They were getting in the end zone a lot.
They were doing this. Feed
Yep.
Zeke.
Yep. But last year, those metrics came down to a certain degree, especially early on in the season. They ended up kind of correcting itself over the course of the season. But when you look at this Cowboys team overall, like, it's been one of the best consistently when Dak is healthy, best teams in football, September through December. They won their division last year. The Eagles kind of fell off at the very end. They've had 3 consecutive 12-win seasons. In fact, Mike McCarthy, who you mentioned, has won more games over the last 3 years in the regular season, of course, than any coach in the league not named Andy Reid. Now, Andy Reid has his 2 Super Bowls to show for all that. But regardless, like, very good in the regular season. Cowboys fans have no complaints about what's been going on in the regular season, although there are games here and there that you can nitpick. It's the playoffs that we continuously talk about every year. I won't expand beyond that because I'm sure we'll address offseason, X factors, and how all this factors into this postseason upcoming. But that's the focus for all Cowboys fans. It's like, can this be the year that they at least break through with some kind of playoff success? Another 12-5 year, but an inexplicable 48-32 home loss to the Green Bay Packers was, the kind of dagger in the heart of Cowboys fans after what was a very promising season where they won the division. So right. If you have nothing else to add to that, let's talk about the offseason, because I'm sure you'll have some things to say, some fired up things to say about the offseason one way or the other, positively or negatively. So go ahead and start us off here.
I'll start with this. I'll say that, I would say the draft was very positive.
Yep.
I felt good about the picks we made outside of I thought we reached on linebacker in the 3rd round, but either way, you're betting on tools in the 3rd round at the linebacker spot. That's not a horrible pick. And so far in camp, the returns have been good on Tyler Guyton and Cooper Beebe, the 2 offensive line picks that we had that we're going to end up relying on at a time or two at this point at this season, because we still don't know what our center position looks like. We do have a starter set in stone. I can't think of his name at the moment, replacing Tyler Biadasz, but he struggled in recent practice against the Rams in their joint practices. So it could be Cooper Beebe in that spot. It could be this other player. We're not sure yet, but Tyler Guyton, as of right now, the hype train is real right now. Whether that translates into the season, we'll see. But I'll start with that. Just I thought the draft was very positive. But here's the other part, though. The part that obviously I have to address. I think the strategy of basically
going to essentially your employees and being like, win a Super Bowl or else, like essentially with a gun to their head, like putting their jobs on the line, essentially threatening your players and your coaches. I don't like. I understand that nothing else has worked, and maybe they feel a little bit desperate, but I don't think, from a moral standpoint or a actual human standpoint, that will be indicative to the highest level of performance. And we'll see if that plays out on the field or not. But I just want to make sure I get that point across. Like, I really don't agree with this particular philosophy this off season.
Okay, fair enough. Here's what I'll say about the Cowboys offseason. I cheated a little bit here, but if you will allow me to do so, one of the underrated acquisitions that was already a guy who's already on this team who got hurt after 2 games last year is Trayvon Diggs, one of the Cowboys' best defensive assets and just flat out good football players on this team. He's coming back from a torn ACL, and I consider that because he barely played last year, only in 2 games before that devastating knee injury occurred.
Yeah, in those 2 games that he played alongside Deron Bland, that was elite cornerback play. So that'll get you excited.
That was all the turnovers and stuff that you saw. I consider him coming back an acquisition, even though he's already on the roster. That's good news for Dallas. Now, I expect him to return healthy and be back to at least some version of what he has been, which I do think will happen. So that's kind of on my list. I'm going to ask you a question here in a minute about the defensive coordinator hire, but some other things that I like that the Cowboys did, even though there wasn't a ton of it. I like the offensive line additions through the draft. There's only so much you can do when you lose a guy like Tyron Smith, right? I mean, you're not really going to replace that void of a perennial all-pro like Tyron Smith, a veteran like that. Losing a guy like that, it leaves a big hole there. And no rookie, no matter who it was that the Cowboys drafted, even if it was like Olu Fashanu or, Joe Alt, was going to start out right away being as good as what Tyron Smith was. But I did like injecting some youth into this offensive line. The concern with Guyton, in my opinion, is much like some of these other offensive linemen who have been drafted in the first round the past couple of years, Guyton is very limited on experience at the college level. 14 career starts on the offensive line and only 1 at left tackle. That's one concern. The other concern is he does have some flaws in pass protection, but if you look at the amount of snaps, and I don't know how they, calculate these metrics, but if you look at the amount of snaps that Guyton was in pass protection when the quarterback took a traditional drop back, I guess, of 3 or more steps, Guyton was in pass protection on traditional dropbacks just 32% of the time last year. So while he's not perfect in pass protection and he will need to improve upon that, you like a lot of the athletic traits, you like a lot of the things you're hearing in camp. And at the end of the day, like, sometimes you have to, even if it was a little bit of a reach, you got to get your guy. And I like the youth that he provides, and I like the room that he has to grow. And then to a lesser extent, I really like the Cooper Beebe value in the 3rd round. I think he's ready to contribute right away. He could start at guard. He could start at center. But, I think his power fit with what's going to just be kind of a block and run kind of running game. I think that was a good addition. And then my last thing I'll say is I did like the Eric Kendricks signing for really cheap. I think it was $3.5 million.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because I think you would agree linebacker was a little bit of a weak link last year. And, aside from Micah, and Kendricks is familiar with the Mike Zimmer defense. And, the production speaks for itself. 100 tackles in 8 straight seasons with both the Vikings and the Chargers. So I really like that for good value. Those are kind of my 3 emphasis points for the offseason. But now, and you can share whatever thoughts you have, but what is your assessment of the Mike Zimmer hire at defensive coordinator?
I really like it. I actually, if you remember, was asking for my Cowboys to hire Mike Zimmer as their head coach because I see him as a culture builder. He's not going to take any BS. He's old school and he's going to be tough on his players, but also we know his system works in the NFL. Like it's been proven year over year over year. And also, it's been a long time since Mike Zimmer has had a defense this talented. The thing that I'm really excited about in terms of his scheme fitting with our team is he likes to bring 2 linebackers up into the A gaps, and I think that's also why they drafted the linebacker out of Notre Dame.
Yep.
But he likes to bring those linebackers into the A gaps, make the offense make a decision, and then check into whatever they don't choose. Like if the offense decides to max protect, you drop both of them. If they don't, you bring both, or you bring one or the other. I think it really fits with Micah Parsons in that aspect. I'm really excited to see how Micah Parsons is used this season.
I would agree. Anything else on the off season before we go into X factors?
Well, actually, 2 more things. On the Eric Kendrick signing, another reason to love it is I think he's a great mentor to our 2 young guys at the linebacker position, Damone Clark and DeMarvion Overshone from Texas. Overshone is coming back off of an injury, so this is essentially his rookie season. And then Clark has shown good things in the NFL. He just has to improve as a zone defender, like just in terms of zone feel. And once he does that, he'll be a top half linebacker in the NFL, which is all you need at that position, which is essentially the running back of the defense. Yep. Oh, and Mozzie Smith. Sorry, that was the other thing I wanted to mention. He lost 30 pounds before the start of last season, and that's why he struggled so much to hold the point of attack. He wasn't able to do the things that he was able to do at Michigan. This year, though, he's gained that weight back. Whether it's good weight or not, and whether he'll be able to do the things he did at Michigan, we'll see. But the voices from camp so far, the sources from camp so far that I've been listening to have overwhelmingly said positive things about Mozzie Smith. So that's going to be a big deal.
Absolutely. That kind of leads us straight into X factors. He was my first guy. At times last year, times in the past, the run defense has been squishy. It's not all on the guys up front, but to a large degree, like we know about Oso Odigizua, who has 9 career sacks and is one of the proven performers up front on this defense. But I think Mozzie Smith, who they drafted last year out of Michigan, will need to step up. Now, regardless of his disappointing rookie season and whatever may have contributed to that, I have confidence that he will. Like everything that I'm hearing, and maybe I'm not as plugged in as you are to Cowboys camp, is that he's looked really good, or a lot better than what he did last year. Right. So I think the defensive line on the interior will be very important to the Cowboys how much success. Now, I think the Cowboys are going to be a top 5, top 7 defense regardless, but that will play a big role. And they also, I think they drafted a couple guys. Marshawn Nealon's a guy out of Western Michigan, who they drafted, who you can get excited about. I think there were a couple others, but yeah, that's one of the big ones for me is Mozzie Smith. And then I still think this Cowboys team has maybe the best guard duo in the NFL in Tyler Smith and Zach Martin. For me, it's those tackles that will play a big role in pass protection. Think about, is it Terrence Steele at right
he
tackle?
really struggled last season.
He's going to be big. And then obviously you're probably starting a rookie at left tackle. So protecting Dak is going to be important because when Dak has time to throw and can process in the pocket, he's like right up there with one of the elite of the – he's like almost an elite quarterback when he's provided that pocket. And
Right.
He can step up and process what he's seeing. He's an elite processor of information that he sees play to play when everything is pass protected very well. I think that's something that our guy TFG talked about when he talked about Dak on his preview. So the tackles and the defensive line come to mind, but I know there are other things you want to mention here. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head in terms of X factors. I think the tackles are going to be huge. One thing that has been talked about amongst Cowboys fans is the possibility of benching Terrence Steele if he really struggles. And in that case, most likely you move in Cooper Beebe into either the center or the guard spot, and then you possibly move Tyler Smith out to left tackle again, and then Guyton back to right tackle where he played at Oklahoma. So that could be a possibility if Terrence Steele really struggles, but I also don't think that's a good scenario for the Cowboys because that means it got really bad. The other X factor, run defense, of course, but more so like just defense against the best offenses in the league. We know they can kick the shit out of Mac Jones and Zach Wilson, but can you stop Lamar Jackson on a 3rd and 8 in the fourth quarter of a tight game? Can you hold Joe Burrow on a 3rd down and keep him from picking you apart in the fourth quarter? Like things like that. I think this defense is really good, but I think if they're going to be good enough to get us through the playoffs, it has to be that gets better. And I think with the corners being healthy, that could get better.
Something else to look out for, and then I want to ask you a question, is just in general. I'm not saying this means anything or has anything to do with the Cowboys' success this year, but last year in particular, when the Cowboys got a lead going into halftime, they were like the best team in football. They were 11-1 last year when they led at halftime. But when they trailed, they were 1-4. Now, I don't know what goes into that. I didn't watch every single Cowboys game start to finish last year. But that could be a trend. Maybe it's not. Maybe it is. Something to look out for since I am considered the stat. What am I? The stat king?
Yeah.
I thought I'd bring that up. The offense was really good last year, especially when they figured out some of their red zone issues after the start that they had to the season. But when you look at the defenses that they played to a certain degree last year, it was not a strong schedule, particularly of the opposing defenses that they played. Number 32, Arizona, number 29, Chargers, number 28 Panthers, number 25 Giants, number 24 Seattle, the Commanders twice. It doesn't mean anything. It might not mean, it might mean something, but they played 11 games against defenses that didn't rank in the top 20. So it remains to be seen, how that offense fares against some of the more elite defenses in football. I think it's going to fare very well. Now, the question I have for you is, and feel free to respond to anything I just said, are you concerned at all? Maybe you aren't, but are you concerned at all about the wide receiver room outside of CeeDee Lamb?
Yeah, that's actually one thing I did want to mention, but I had been rambling so long, so I was like, I'll cut it off. But yes, I am concerned about that. Brandon Cooks is getting older. He's 32 years old, and he's a guy who relies on vertical speed and winning at the catch point. And those are things that tend to degrade over time, naturally. And then beyond that, you have, shoot,
Is it Jalen Tolbert?
yeah, Jalen Tolbert. Sorry, yeah, thank you. Jalen Tolbert is going to be a guy we rely on for sure this year. He's going to be kind of in the Michael Gallup role. Dak's going to throw a lot of 50-50 balls to him, and Tolbert's going to be expected to go out and win those. We also brought in a receiver from the XFL. He was one of the top 5 or 6 in receiving yards last year in the XFL. We brought him in, and it's looking like he's going to make the roster. He's had a really good camp so far, and he's been extremely productive in the preseason games as well. I can't remember his name for the life of me at the moment, but that's something to keep an eye on as well. We're relying on some young guys to have to step up.
So with that being said, I think if I wanted to say a third X factor for this Cowboys team, given that I already mentioned the tackles and Mozzie Smith, I would say Jake Ferguson is potentially an X factor offensively, even though Brandon Cooks had 8 touchdowns last year, he averaged a career low in yards per game. You mentioned him aging, eventually some of that is going to continue to, as we expect, maybe decline slowly, but surely. You're going to need other younger guys to step up because you can't rely upon Brandon Cooks. Jalen Tolbert showed growth in year 2. He's still only 24. But he only had 24 catches. He only has 24 catches through 2 NFL seasons. So to a certain extent, he's still unproven. So I think Jake Ferguson, given what we saw last year, will probably end up being like, if you're in fantasy leagues and you're looking to draft Cowboys offense, I think CD is obviously your number 1, and then Jake Ferguson might be your number 2 pass catcher for Dak this year.
Another note on fantasy really fast is I think Zeke is going to be in the kind of the David Montgomery, Jamal Williams type of role in the red zone. I think he has the possibility of getting 8 to 10 touchdowns this season. The whole reason we brought him back is for short yardage. So we'll see if that comes into fruition. But let's get into the over-under win totals here, and then we'll move on to the next team. This is my favorite team, so we planned on this one being a little longer, and then the next 2 teams will be 15 to 20 minutes ish. So over-under win total for the Cowboys is at 9.5.
Interesting.
I'm going to say they win. I'm going to say they win 10 games on the dot. They play. So here's my reasoning. They outscored the Giants and the Commanders 173 to 46, I think, in the 4 games they played.
Yeah.
So while those teams did get better, I don't expect that they closed that gap completely. So that's essentially hopefully 4 wins, given Dak's track record within this division. And then you play the NFC South. You expect to win against the Saints and the Panthers. That's another 2 wins. Now, the other part of the schedule is just that's where you're splitting hairs here. You play the 49ers, you play the Texans, you play the AFC North as well. So it's not the easiest schedule in the world, but it's certainly not a gauntlet or anything.
We're, again, I don't think I'm going over on every team, but I've gone over on a lot of the teams that we've done so far. But if it's 9.5, I was going to say over. If it was 10.5, I was going to say under. But right at 10 wins is where I kind of see it. I just think, look, you're playing the AFC North. I think at best case scenario, you're hoping for 2-1 there, or 2-2, maybe 3-1. Best case scenario, 3-1, but realistically, maybe two. Like I think it'll be 2-2 or 3-1, and however that ends up could determine whether they win 10 or 11 even games. Now you are playing that first place schedule, which hurts you a little bit. That's how you end up with San Francisco and Houston.
Yeah.
But the Houston game is at home. The Cowboys, if you can say anything about them over the past 3 years, have been elite at home for the most part.
In the regular season.
And I think they're gonna continue to beat up on at least the Commanders, even though I do think the Commanders could be better than people think, but the Cowboys just have their number, I think. And then I don't think the Giants are going to be very good. Now, could they win 7-8 games? Maybe. But I just still don't believe in that team. So, especially against the Cowboys. So I think there will be enough wins in division. They'll be minimum 500, hopefully, provided health against the AFC North. And they'll beat most of the teams they play in the NFC South. So I think 10 wins is the bare minimum in the regular season, given the key players are healthy.
Yeah, and I wouldn't bet on them winning 11 or 12 just because I think they noticeably got worse in a lot of different areas, including depth. In a lot of spots, they're very thin. But yeah, with that, we'll move on. Thanks for bearing with us there, or with me, rather. I talked a lot in that segment, but we're going to move on here to our next team. This is a team that we actually, late in the process, moved 2 spots down, and we'll talk about that here in just a second, and that is the Los Angeles Rams. Last year went 10-7, 4-1 in their last 5 games. So finished the year very strong, and going into the playoffs were a team that not many teams wanted to play with how Matthew Stafford was playing and how that offense was humming. And overall, like that season, to get that result with as many young players and rookies that they had on that team was, I thought, a masterful coaching job by Sean McVay. And honestly, I honestly think Sean McVay and Matthew Stafford might be the best quarterback coach combo in the NFC. That might be a hot take, given that Brock Purdy and Kyle Shanahan exist, but that's how I feel about it. I think what we know is that Sean McVay is always going to innovate his offense, and he's going to maximize what he gets out of his team.
Yeah, I think for the Rams, who we did move 2 spots down, we'll explain that once we get to the offseason, because they had a major retirement that went on.
Right.
But the same questions remain after last offseason. There were a ton of questions about how the 2023 Rams would fare. Would they actually be a good team? How would they finish? Would a 35-year-old Matthew Stafford recover from, that spinal cord contusion from the season before, a season where he had his worst EPA or expected points added since his rookie year in Detroit? Or would Matthew Stafford, given his age and that injury, consider retirement? And then there was also the same questions before last year about Aaron Donald and would he retire. Now he ended up playing, of course, last year and ended up retiring this offseason, but those questions existed. There was questions going into the season about Cooper Kupp. He sustained a hamstring injury during a practice in training camp, experienced a setback towards the end of August. How would the defense perform a year ago? Those were all questions about the Rams. But in the end, they had a very good draft last year. They ended up getting one of the star rookie receivers of last year. That was Puka Nacua, who became the third player in NFL history to record at least 10 catches and 100 receiving yards in his NFL debut. And I guess you could say to a certain extent, this team overachieved a little bit in what they were able to accomplish, especially going down the stretch. And they just had kind of a heartbreaker at the end. What was a 1-point loss to the Detroit Lions, who to be fair were like a half away from playing for the Super Bowl. But they did lose that game 24-23 in the wild card round. So very good season for the Rams a year ago. And it was an interesting offseason for LA. Should we go ahead and jump into the offseason?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Why don't you start us off here? Go ahead.
Okay. My number one move by the Rams this offseason was signing Darius Williams, bringing him back from the Jaguars. He fits their system. He's really good as a kind of cover four, eyes on the quarterback zone corner. And I think him coming back to the Rams, I think it's a great move for both sides. He's just best matched in this system and has played well as a Ram. And I think the Rams desperately needed a guy like him. They needed a veteran desperately. The corners they had last year were they had good moments, but they weren't very consistent. Just given that they were so young. So a veteran in the room can kind of mentor some of these other guys on the system that they're running. So I overall really good move. Other one, bringing in Jared Verse in the first round. Spoiler alert, he's also going to be one of my X factors here later on. But big time edge rusher to bring in the first round. I think they loved his tools, obviously. They loved the potential, but a lot of what we think this defense could be this year kind of falls on what Jared Verse is this year. So that's going to be very interesting to see. The third move I wanted to point out was bring in Blake Corum. Last year, they really leaned on Kyron Williams. And obviously just in terms of like, I guess, practicality, like you really don't want to have to lean on one guy. And I think Blake Corum is a very similar skill set, a very similar body type, kind of that 5'9", 200 pounds, very good vision. So when those two switch out for each other, one of them subs in, you're not getting much drop off and you're not getting much difference in play style either.
Yeah, we're very similar in our lists. One difference, but I like that you mentioned the backfield. I think the backfield could be an X factor this season. But I wanted to go ahead and start out my list by mentioning what they did to their interior offensive line as a whole. I thought was much needed and very impressive. They spent a combined $50 million in guaranteed money to shore up the interior of their offensive line. They bring back Kevin Dotson. He was a trade that they made with Pittsburgh a couple years back. He was very good last year. One of the best, like, graded out guards, according to PFF, in the entire league. I still wish we had him in Pittsburgh, but we've done a pretty good job remaking our offensive line. That's a story for another day. But Kevin Dotson, re-signing him was crucial, and then going out and just getting Jonah Jackson from potentially the best offensive line in the NFL a year ago from the Detroit Lions. That way you can move Steve Avila to center. Like, the way they reworked the interior of the offensive line, I really like. That's on my list. I also like Jared Verse. Again, I've been a huge advocate of what Mike Norvell is doing at Florida State. And the fact that they were able to recognize this kid when he was playing, I think it was JUCO ball, or it was Division III, and bring him in through the portal, and what he turned into at Florida State was incredible. I became a very big fan, especially if you know his story. But he's going to be much needed, as you mentioned. But I like, the physicality and relentless effort that he can bring off the edge. And then I would side with you on the Darius Williams edition, but I did also like some of the other pieces that they added. Jordan Fuller leaves, but they go out and they get not only Darius Williams, they sign a veteran in Tre'Davious White, and then they go out and get a safety to pair with their other safety, Russ Yeast, at strong safety, and Cameron Curl, who's been very solid for the Commanders the past couple of years. I like what they did in the secondary. Those are all veteran players, Darius Williams being the household name, of course, who's already familiar with this system. But interior line, their early draft, I'd even throw in Braden Fisk a little bit into that discussion. And then what they did in their secondary, really solid moves. Now there are questions up front, and I guess that's where we get into our X factors.
Right. The first X factor for me, let me get his name right. The defensive tackle from last year who kind of broke out next alongside Aaron Donald, Kobe Turner, rather. Sorry. He was fantastic last year as a rookie. I think he ended up going in like the 4th round or 5th round of the draft. I think he was early day 3 pick, something like that. Really interesting steal of a pick for them. But the reason why he's an X factor is not just because of his talent, but also because of what they have behind him. They don't have a lot of versatility in terms of skill sets in their defensive line room. There's a lot of undersized type of defensive tackles, a lot of defensive tackles that specialize in pass rush, and in a cover 4 shell system that they like to run here. In order to stop the run, a lot of pressure is put on those defensive tackles up front to be able to 2-gap and be able to hold their ground against double teams. So Kobe Turner is going to have to do that really well this year. And you mentioned Braden Fisk. He's going to have to do that as well. I thought at certain points he struggled with that in college. So it'll be interesting to see how they coach up that group.
Absolutely. Sorry, just watching Kenny Pickett get fucked by a certain degree by the Patriots defense in preseason. But nonetheless, I agree with you. Like, this and I was kind of not oblivious to the fact that they lost Aaron Donald specifically, but the amount of unproven young talent that they're relying upon on their defensive front was kind of a surprise to me. So I think not only Kobe Turner, who was really good last year, like his pass rush win rate next to Aaron Donald was really good. I can't remember the
I think
exact
it was like
number.
15%.
Yeah, something along those lines. Now the burden is upon him. And so I think the question, he's number one, and I have the most confidence in him being really solid. Maybe he's not elite, but really solid. My questions come with Braden Fisk, a rookie who they're going to rely upon a lot. I think more so Fisk will be useful in pass rush downs. What my concern is with him is obviously holding up in run defense. He struggled in that area, as you mentioned. And then with Jared Verse, the question is not whether he has, the play strength, the toughness, and all of that. It's, does he have the elite athleticism to really have that high ceiling of becoming uh, at
Top
least a
tier
B
guy.
tier, yeah, a B plus tier or A tier pass rusher in the league. So up front defensively is definitely an X factor. In terms of like positive, because that is a concern, I think the backfield could easily be one of the strengths of this team. Kyron Williams had a breakout year last year. He finished with over 1,100 yards, which is a career high, and 15 touchdowns. Now, they relied upon him a ton. But he finished number 15 in scrimmage yards overall in the league. And so the fact that they bring in Blake Corum in the third round to complement him, that could be it could be a duo that you end up really liking if you're a Rams fan, considering they remade the interior of that offensive line. So what else? I mean, it kind of at the end of the day, like if Matthew Stafford is Matthew Stafford with the weapons that they have, which I mean, Puka Nakua, Cooper Cup, one of the best duos in my mind. You add in, I think they brought in Colby Parkinson at tight end. You draft Jordan Whittington, and I think from what I'm hearing, he's going to make the roster and potentially like get significant playing time. It's kind of a possession down receiver. I like the fact that you have Sean McVay, one of the best play callers in football. I think this offense is going to still be really good. The questions I think are more so on defense. And so if you have anything else to add, you can, but I think we should address the outlook for the Rams since we're at 50.
Yeah, that's it for that. I think in terms of the outlook, I see this team as a offensive minded team. I
Same here.
think this offense has the potential to be top 5 in the league in just about every statistical category. You look at Matthew Stafford at quarterback. I mean, you can make the argument he was the best quarterback in the NFC last season. And I think we did make that argument in our quarterback bracket if you want to go watch that. But man, I mean, possibly the best season of his career, top to bottom. And I think got a first place vote in the MVP discussion as well. So not expecting any drop off there. And then the running game, I think, could be really, really good as well. So
I agree.
I feel great about the offense. I think they're going to be able to win some shootouts. But I think ultimately, whether they can, consistently put up 27, 30, 35 points is going to kind of decide where this season goes.
So What's their over-under? I think it's 8.5, if I'm reading that right.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. What's your feel on that?
Yeah. This is to address why we moved them down. This is kind of why we moved them down is we think that they have a wide range of outcomes because of the lack of depth on defense. You look at the linebacker room. If Ernest Jones goes down, you have replacement level, backup level talent and the linebacker core behind him. So little things like that make it kind of hard to predict where this team is at. But I'm gonna say they win 9 or 10 games. I'm gonna say they win 9 or 10 games just because I believe in Matthew Stafford and Sean McVay. What I said earlier, I believe it. I think they're the best quarterback coach combo in the NFC, and I think with the kind of heads up power run game that they're going to be implementing and all of the size they have on the front line now, and Steven Avila, who's a 330-pound center, that's unprecedented. So I'm excited to see uh, that part of it, and I'm going with the over.
Yeah, I think I can't pick under with Sean McVay and a healthy Matthew Stafford because I do think like when he's healthy, you can make an argument he's the best, maybe the best quarterback in the NFC. I do think this offense is going to score enough points to win more games than they lose. Now, having said all that, well, actually, not really an exception, but their home schedule isn't easy because they host the Eagles, they host the Packers, they host the Vikings. They might, I mean, that should be a win, but they do host the Bills and they host the Dolphins. They have tough home games, but history says that under Sean McVay, the Rams are really good at home. They're 36-21 at home, and they're actually been dominant against the division under Sean McVay. 28-14 against the NFC West in Sean McVay's tenure. Winning double the amount of games that you lose in your division, in a division that's as good as the NFC West, is that's impressive. I think that'll continue. I think the NFC has gotten better, and that's something you have to account for here. But
For sure.
like Sean McVay is just going to outcoach a lot of the opposing coaches that he goes up against, in my opinion. So I think the Rams will find a way to have a winning record. Whether or not they're in the playoffs, depending on how Seattle does, could factor into things. But that's all we really need to say on the Rams. Let's move on to the Bills. What do you say?
Right. Yeah. Let's get into it.
All right. So for Buffalo, I'll go ahead and start us off here. Here's the thing with Buffalo. Weird off season. Now, 2021, 11-6, 2022, 13-4. Last year, 11-6. And it ended once again with that buzzword that Bills fans just cannot stand. The Kansas City Chiefs being that buzzword.
I thought you were going to say wide right.
That too. But it ended once again at the hands of the Kansas City Chiefs. But you don't feel sympathy for any NFL team. It's the NFL. Injuries happen. But what the Bills dealt with last year was kind of ridiculous. It was a year of overcoming for Buffalo. Matt Milano, fractured leg against the Jaguars, out for the season. Tre'Davious White, torn Achilles in week 4 against the Dolphins, out for the season. Daquan Jones, torn pectoral muscle in week 5, out for the season. Ed Oliver, toe injury, missed 3 games, Micah Hyde, neck injury, missed 3 games. Jordan Poyer, knee injury, missed 1 game. Greg Russo, ankle injury, missed 2 games. Von Miller, continued recovery from an ACL injury. Wasn't really a big factor last year. That's just on defense. Then you had an injury to Dawson Knox, who hurt his wrist in a game over in London and had to miss 5 weeks. And then on top of that, you had Dalton Kincaid, who missed a couple of games. It was just, I think they had some injuries on the offensive line, if I'm not mistaken. It was not a good year of luck on the injury front for the Buffalo Bills. But having said all that, they still were able to win enough games. They get to the playoffs, and then it's just like, oh, so frustrating. They found themselves where they wanted to be. They were right where they wanted to be. They were at home. They were against the team that they're trying to get over the hump against, the Kansas City Chiefs. They were leading the game at halftime. And not only leading the game at halftime, they were leading the game going into the fourth quarter. And what happened? Well, despite all of that, they still couldn't find a way to get past Kansas City. It was frustrating because the Bills are Josh Allen's team to a certain extent. Well, they are actually. And it was really the running game and special teams were what cost the Bills in that game. They had 3 possessions, down 3 in the fourth quarter, with a chance to go and get victory. On the first series, you had on 1st and 10 an 8-yard Josh Allen run. On 2nd and 2, they run the ball and they lose 3 yards. And 3rd and 5, an incompletion. The running game, once again, kills a drive. The next series, 1st and 10, they run it with James Cook. It's a 4-yard loss. You're already behind the chains. Then they had a 2-yard completion on 2nd and 14. 3rd and 12, an incompletion. You're forced to throw against a vaunted Kansas City secondary, as we know. And then 4th and 12, you punt. On their final 3 drives, and this is also a credit to Kansas City's defense, but on the final 3 drives, I won't go over the entire 3rd drive. Every time Joe Brady called a running play, they lost yards every single time. Some of that was the offensive line. Some of that, I mean, the blame falls on a lot of different people, but it's just like, oh my goodness, you have your chances, Bills, and you just can't get over the hump. So that was 2023 for Buffalo.
Yeah, nothing else really to say there, man. It is a very interesting conversation with that with that playoff game playing out the way it did, with how good Josh Allen played, and then still coming out with the L. Like that's as gut wrenching as it gets. But
at the same time,
like here, sorry,
all those injuries are just insane to look back on. But yes, let's move on. And I'll let you start on the offseason additions.
Yeah, so for all that they lost, which was a lot, they also, I think, did some good things in terms of replacing some of these guys. They brought in Keon Coleman, first pick of the 2nd round. They traded down with that team down in Kansas City again. But regardless, I think they needed an X wide receiver. You look at this receiving core, it's a lot of slot types. Khalil Shakir, Mac Hollins,
Samuel.
Yeah, exactly. Not a lot of guys that you feel very comfortable putting outside and just letting them be the X wide receiver. So you put Keon Coleman in that spot, and while I do think he might long term be a slot receiver also, but for year one's purposes, I think he'll do just fine outside, and it was a much needed addition.
Yeah, for me on Buffalo, because obviously one of the things we mention it in passing, but we don't have a segment cut out to what teams lose. We only really talk about in depth what they gain. Now, but you look at this list of players lost. Stephon Diggs, they traded. Gabriel Davis, he's gone. Leonard Floyd, he's now a 49er. Micah Hyde is gone. I forget which team he ended up with.
I think the Dolphins.
I think you're right on that. But Tre'Davious White, obviously an injury played a huge part in it, but he's gone. Jordan Poyer's out the door. It was a lot to lose, just in terms of veterans. But at the same time, I think they made some good, shrewd moves, including drafting Keon Coleman, who was just a playmaking touchdown machine at Florida State last year. He again was, I think, along with Jared Verse, like those were the two stalwarts in that transfer portal class that brought Florida State to the levels that they achieved, going undefeated up until the horrible injury that occurred to Jordan Travis when they were basically guaranteed to get into the playoffs. But it's not a college football show. But I like Keon Coleman, I really do. We can have an argument, or maybe not have an argument about what receivers were available there and if Keon Coleman was the best choice. But I do think that's a really good addition. He's a freak. I think he's going to do good things in Buffalo. Outside of that, I think I would include re-signing Daquan Jones, which they were able to do. He was a guy that on their defensive line last year was playing at like a really high level. You could maybe even make the argument it was like Pro Bowl level on that defensive line, but then bad luck happens. He tores his pectoral muscle and misses 2/3 of the season. So if he comes back healthy and you get good play from Ed Oliver, pair those two guys together, you're looking at a fairly strong interior of that defensive line for the Bills. I like that. And then outside of that, let's see, what else do they do here? I mean, they had a lot of draft picks. While they didn't have a first, I think they had 2 seconds. They drafted a safety out of Utah. We'll see how that works out. They had a third, a fourth, 3 fifths, 2 sixths, and then I don't know if they had a seventh, but I guess you can throw Curtis Samuel into that equation. Like, it's pretty cheap. I liked it. I mean, they have a lot of depth at that position. I don't know. What else can you include in that? I guess
I would maybe say Von Miller.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
That's kind of a stretch, though. One guy I would point. No. I'll wait to point him out until the X Factors. But yeah, the additions are a little bit limited. So yeah,
let's go into the X Factors. I would, to a certain extent, Von Miller does factor into this equation.
Ooh, actually, I did think of one. I guess you could say Joe Brady as their offensive coordinator.
Yep.
I think
with
all the good things he did to close last season,
Yep.
I would count that as an addition, given he has a whole offseason to game plan.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. X Factors. Where do you look for the Bills in terms of X Factors in 2024?
The first name that pops in my mind is Kyer Elam, their first-round pick from a couple of years ago out of Florida, who has struggled thus far in his career. He's going to need to play well this year for the Bills. He's their – I'll say this. He's their highest ceiling corner in that room by a long way. If you look at the guys they have a few late round selections. They have Rasul Douglas, who's aging. So Kyer Elam, I think, if the Bills want to have a good secondary, he's going to have to step up and be at the very least, a solid number 2 level corner.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. He's an important player given what they lost in their secondary. let's see, their defense. I'm looking at their defense right now. Obviously, I think given that they lose Leonard Floyd, who accounted for 10.5 sacks last year and left in free agency, given that the Bills were actually really good as a pass rush last year, 10th in pressure rate, and were fourth in sacks, H.A. Epinesa, who was a high round draft pick a couple years back, who finished with 6.5 sacks and a 13.9% pressure rate. Having 6.5 sacks in back-to-back seasons, will be an X factor on this defensive front, just replacing the veterans they lost. I like everything else that they kind of have, though. I like Greg Russo, who had a 15.8% pressure rate last year, which was 20th amongst pass rushers. I like the interior of the defensive line as long as it's healthy. Daquan Jones and Ed Oliver, who showed flashes last year. It's just that one side at edge where you have Von Miller, who's an older player, going into his age 35 season, coming off a major injury, and H.A. Epinesa, who, while he's been solid, like you are replacing Leonard Floyd, who was your team leader in sacks. So I think that could factor into how good this defense can be. I think you're right about Kaiir Elam. Offensively, though, don't you think it's kind of like Joe Brady and what we've always been waiting on the Bills to kind of develop into, which is a more consistent, reliable running team in January?
Yeah,
That's probably what I
was.
look at.
Yeah, the name I was going to say next was actually James Cook.
Yeah.
I think he has the most like pop out of the guys on their team as in terms of ball carrier, and I think has potential as a pass catcher as well. He's had drop issues and he's not great in terms of pass protection right now, but if he grows in that aspect, you're looking at, I don't want to compare him to his brother, but you're basically looking at Dalvin Cook in the face at that point.
Yeah. And then I think without the sure thing at wide receiver, the tight ends are going to continue to play a huge role in the
Yeah.
offense. Dalton Kincaid. Do they still have Dawson Knox? I think they do, right?
Yeah, they do.
Those two
I
guys
think he is banged up at the moment, though.
as a tight end duo when both are healthy. Dalton Kincaid, who was a first round investment in the 2023 draft, that began to pay dividends down the stretch last year. 17 catches through the first 6 weeks of the season. It was more Dawson Knox, but once Dawson Knox suffered that wrist injury that I mentioned, Kincaid finished with 73 catches for 670 yards and a pair of touchdowns. I think those numbers are going to take a significant bump. I look for, like, when this team gets in the red zone, look for those tight ends to get a lot of targets because I think are there more reliable? I mean, Curtis Samuel's solid. You like MVS. They also brought him in as a veteran receiver.
Mac
But, like,
Hollins. I like Mac Hollins.
yeah, but like in the red zone, I think those tight ends. Allen loves throwing Dawson Knox the ball. I know that, and
Yeah.
he obviously loved throwing Kincaid the ball. So I think those two guys, again, if you're looking for fantasy tight ends, could have some good value.
Yeah, for sure. You ready to move on to the outlook?
Yeah, let's finish up this episode.
Yeah. So, in terms of outlook, I have a question for you. I think just what is your take on Sean McDermott right now? This is obviously going to be a transition year for the Bills with a lot of roster movement. I mean, you look at the safety position. Damar Hamlin is currently listed as their starting safety, and no disrespect to him, but he's a he's an unknown at this point as an NFL player with what he's been through. Just different stories of that nature all across the roster with unproven young talent. What do you think Sean McDermott will be able to do coaching wise this year?
I think, very simply, I don't think this is a hot take. I think they have to make significant strides in the postseason this year, or I think Sean McDermott is in real danger of losing his job. Now, obviously, we don't wish that on anybody. We don't wish that Sean McDermott loses his job, but I think with the failures the past couple of years in the postseason, point the finger at whoever you want to point the finger at. This is a Bills team that has been with Josh Allen in a Super Bowl window, and they haven't been able to capitalize on that. They haven't achieved those maximum level of expectations. I don't know what you want to say. Like, do they have to get to the AFC Championship game? They have to at least be in the divisional round.
Yeah.
At the very least. If not, it's very, very questionable the outlook for Sean McDermott going into 2025. Like, it's hanging by a thread at that point. But in terms of their outlook for this year, this is the final year of Josh Allen's contract that is semi-reasonable. It jumps from $30 million this year to $61 million next year. So I would argue that this is the year, even with the salary cap going up, like this is the year they really need to capitalize because you just don't know with that quarterback salary doubling next year. That's a prohibitive, to a certain extent, salary hit to your roster and the things that you're able to do in building this thing. I think they're over. What is their over under? Is it 9.5 or 10.5? I think it's 10.5, right?
I actually think it might be 9.5. I'm not entirely sure. Actually, let me double check that.
I have 10.5 on my end, but I could be wrong.
No, I think you might be right. Let me make sure. Yeah, 10.5.
Here's my thing. I love Josh Allen. I really root for the Bills. I do, except when they're playing my team. They beat my team in the playoffs last year, obviously. But I really like Josh Allen. I hope this franchise can eventually experience, and this fan base, Bills Mafia, can eventually experience what they want to experience. But I just look at what they faced a year ago and what they're going to face this year, in terms of defenses. Where is that stat that I had? Okay. This year, they're forecasted to play the number one toughest schedule of defenses. And I think defensively for the Bills, their 2023 schedule was manageable given that they played the sixth easiest schedule of offenses and the sixth easiest schedule of quarterbacks. Look at the QBs, and this was circumstantial. It's not in the Bills' control. Look at the QBs that the Bills faced last year. Zach Wilson, Jimmy Garoppolo, Sam Howell, who was traded, Tyrod Taylor, who's a backup, Mac Jones, who was benched, traded, and now a backup, Tim Boyle, backup, Easton Stick. I didn't even know who Easton Stick was until he played in that game. Bailey Zappi, backup, and Russell Wilson, who was I'll even say that as a Steelers fan. So when you look at that, like Zach Wilson, Jimmy G, Sam Howell, Tyrod Taylor, Mac Jones, Tim Boyle, Easton Stick, Bailey Zappi, and Russell Wilson. Now, to be fair, they did still play Patrick Mahomes. They did still play Dak. They did still play Joe Burrow. They did still play Jalen Hurts. They played good quarterbacks. But this year, you got to play Patrick Mahomes. You got to play Lamar Jackson. You got to play Aaron Rodgers twice, which you didn't have to do last year. Now you got to do that if he's healthy. You got to play Jared Goff. You got to play Matthew Stafford. You got to play Kyler Murray, who's going to be fully healthy, at least we hope. You got to play Brock Purdy and that 49ers offense. May or may not have Ayuk. I'm getting sick and tired of that. Tua twice. That Bills, that we already talked about the Dolphins. That Dolphins offense, regardless of what their team is, could be a nightmare to deal with. You got to play Geno Smith. You got to play C.J. Stroud, and you got to play Trevor Lawrence. I just think with that schedule, I'll take the under on 10.5. I'll go they win 10 games, but they're under 10.5. I just don't see them winning. It's just a brutal schedule of quarterbacks to get through.
Yeah, I'm gonna say the under also. I mean, you have Josh Allen, so you got a shot, and I think that's why Vegas gives them the benefit of the doubt, putting them at 10.5. But at the end of the day, I still do think, they won 11 games last year, and they come into this year worse and with a much tougher schedule. So I think it's just only natural that you have a little bit of regression in wins. Not to mention, there could be some variance in terms of how these young players do as well.
Yeah. That about does it for this episode. I think we had a really good episode. This is the last NFL preview episode that we will do where we are doing 3 teams. We're now going into our final tier, basically, of the Super Bowl threats. And then we obviously have one team at the top in its own kind of tier. Probably guess who that is as of right now. But we'll be going 2 teams per episode from here on out. Our top 8. This is really probably our Super Bowl bubble. Like, these are the teams we envision in that Super Bowl race. So I don't know about Sunday. Sunday could be actually a baseball episode. It could be another dit hole reacting to the Longhorns scrimmage and some other things that I have in mind. I haven't talked with Emmy about. But early next week, we're going to continue this. We might do 2 NFL episodes next week, given that it's August 15th, so we are like 3 weeks away from that first Thursday, night game to open the season. And we've got 4 episodes left to do in terms of NFL previews. So we're probably going to have to do 2 in a week here pretty soon. But there will only be 2 teams per episode. So get excited for that. Thank you guys for tuning in. Emmy, do you have any parting shots?
Ooh, parting shot. How many of the coaches that we talked about in this video will be with their teams at the end of the year? Mike McCarthy, hot seat, potentially. Sean McDermott, hot seat, potentially. Not really with the Rams. That's never going to happen. But the other 2 teams, you could see it.
Yeah, I think if you said over under 1.5 of these 3 coaches with their team next year, I don't know, man. That's a difficult bet. I don't want to say under because I don't want to wish that upon any of these coaches. But at the same time, like, it could very easily happen that way. I think, to be honest with you, I don't know that Sean McVay is very interested in coaching that much longer. Because he's flirted with retirement recently.
Yeah, I personally think he might ride it out with Stafford until Stafford goes, but you have a point. He has considered broadcasting positions in the past. So it could be like a John Gruden type situation.
And I
except
think
the coach
ultimately, like with not so much with McVay to an extent, because he's won a Super Bowl, he's established in the postseason, and McCarthy's won a Super Bowl, obviously, but hasn't had that success with the Cowboys. And McDermott has had his struggles and fair share of criticism in the postseason. I think the Bills and Cowboys, in certain respects, are very similar, just in that they've had their different versions of postseason failure. They both have quarterbacks that, maybe not with Dak so much this year, but if they pay Dak, that cap hit going into next year could be very prohibitive to a certain degree. And I think that Josh Allen, what we talked about, doubling his cap hit, like it's something you want to take advantage on when you have these quarterbacks on the salaries that are manageable. And so I think postseason success for both the Bills and the Cowboys is paramount for both of those coaches to keep their jobs. Okay. Well, we're going to be back probably in about 25 minutes with Dit Hole. It's going to be another loaded show of Dit Hole. Hopefully it's not an hour 50 minutes like we did on Sunday, but we had a lot to talk about, and it was a really good episode. We're going to be addressing 3 teams, just like we did here, but they're not going to, like the college previews aren't as extensive as the NFL ones. And then we're going to be continuing to talk about the Texas football roster. Tonight, we will be talking about the secondary. I know the secondary is a hot topic in Texas football land, given what happened last year. And that was kind of the weak link of the entire team. So we'll talk about that. But until then, until 25 minutes from now, this is the Raw Prospect Podcast, our series of 2024 NFL team previews. The Cowboys at number 11, the Rams at number 10, and the Bills at number 9. So for Michael Ween, he's Emmy Nixon, and we'll see you soon. Peace out.
Peace.